I'd like to take a minute and jump back in the code and take a look at one item that's been added that we haven't talked about yet. On the form load, automatically, when we did the drag and drop, this line right here was added in, and this line is what fills our data set, or fills our table adapter, if you will. Now, how does it do that? Well, it executes that select statement that we embedded within our data set. And also, before I go on, let's take a look at this. This data set we created originally in the first demonstration by hand. In the second demonstration, this data set was automatically created for me. Let's go back here and take a look again. So anytime that I issue this table adapter .fill, and what am I filling? I'm passing in the data set and the table from that. Anytime that I issue this command right here, it's going to refill that data set, initially wipe out what's there, reread that data set. Now let's go back in and take a look at the application again. One of the things that we're not doing right now is we're not updating our data set, which means that all the changes that I'm making right now are being made locally in memory in the local data set, but at no time is it ever telling it to go back out and update the underlying database or the underlying table that this data represents or this data is linked to. So we're going to have to go back in and add that ourselves. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. That's the creativity of writing programs, is how do you want to have your data updated? Do you want to have a button and have the users update that data? Or perhaps you want to just automatically update that data anytime changes are made. So let me give you a for instance. What I could do is I could come back over here to this data grid and say, anytime a row is changed, issue an update. Great thing about the update statement is that if no updates have occurred, meaning I haven't done any insert updates or deletes, issuing the update statement will cause nothing to happen. It will only launch if there's anything behind the scenes that need to be updated. So over issuing updates is not inefficient. So let's take a look at how I might want to do that. So right here, I'm going to come back, take a look at my event handlers on this grid, and I'm going to try to find a change event for the row. So let's see if we can look down through here and see when a row is changed by the user, I'm going to issue an update, which means they may have entered new data, they may have edited data down below, but anytime they change the row, which also means leaving, we've got row enter, we got row text change. So there's a lot of different ways that we could do this. So here's row leave, and row leave, it might be one of the ones that we would like to use. Anytime we leave a row, so our focus changes, because remember, if we're going to edit data, we have to select that row. So the moment we unselect that row, we're leaving that row, and we could embed that code right here. Another thing that we could do is we could embed it even at a lower level. We could come back in and say when the cell value changes, anytime you change a cell value, and editing it down here also changes the value up above, and we could put it there. But if we go back in and look at our code right now, we've already got a solution of a place to put it. We've already delved into that. Let's take a look at this. Right here. Earlier, when we created this element right here, we said anytime a row changes, we want this element to be updated. Well, that would be a perfect place to go back in and do an update then. So let's try that. Let's come back over here, and the update statement is going to be very similar to what we see right here. In fact, if I grab this code out here and I copy it and I jump down below here, right at the end of this statement, I can paste that in and change that from a fill to a dot update. Here you have it. That is one method to do it. Another method that we might want to use to update that data set might be a button up here. So we would have perhaps an edit button and we would have an update button. Now it's important though to understand that the moment then that you click either edit or add, you would want to disable these buttons right here. Disable them, because you don't want people to be able to select next or previous while you're in the process of adding. So disable that, make that not available at all. Then over here, as soon as you click add or edit, at that point, then you want to disable the add or edit buttons and only leave an update and perhaps a cancel button over here to let the user cancel out of it. And there is, when you're issuing an update, there is a way to do a cancel. If you went back in and you take a look at that binding source, there is a method in there called cancel. I believe it's called cancel update. And it will disregard any information you've updated and basically wipe it out. I would suggest then that you come up with a way to update your data. Right now, any data that I insert, that I update, should be changed. Let's just test it out and see how that's going to work. So I've got William R Reeve as my very first record that's going to be popping up, and he donated $5,000. Let's just change Mr. Reeve's name from William R just back to William, and I'm just going to change rows. If I click back, he's just William. Let's see if he actually updated the underlying data by stopping the program, and let's rerun it again. And there he is, William Reeve, and the data was updated. So it's showing you that my update statement is working, and all I had to do was change records, or I could have, since I'm sitting on this row right now, anytime I click one of these buttons, I'm leaving the row. I don't believe by clicking down below here, I'm leaving the row, because there's that relationship between this data and this data. What I'd like to do next is go back to that data set and do a little magic. Let's take a look at this. So right now within my table donations, you'll notice that I have a name, a city, state, zip, an occupation, the date, etc. But I've got the state and I've got the zip in here, the city and the state in here, and I really don't need that because I've got another table that will allow me to pull the city and state out. In a lot of my designs, I like to not give the user the ability to put the city and state in. I give them the ability to put a zip code in, and then once they put a zip code in, I relate it back to that city and state so they don't have to type it in, and I've got a valid city-state. They're not going to mistype it. Let's take a look at how to do that. First thing I want to do is I'm going to do a right click. I'm going to add in a new table adapter. I'm going to use the same connection string. I don't have to change that this time. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. Wants to know what kind of statement I'm going to use. It's going to be a SQL select statement. And then it wants me to come back in and give it the select statement. I'll use a query builder. And this time I'm going to select table zip codes. Right there. And then I'm going to close that out. And in the table zip codes, the only thing that I really want returned will be the zip, which is the primary key, the city, and the state. And then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then go ahead and finish this off. And now my data set has two different table adapters in there. I have table donations and I have table zip codes. And over here you'll see in my data sources, which again is just another way of looking at this same screen here, that I have that same data. Now the next thing I'd like to do is I'm going to relate the data. I'm going to take this zip code and I'm going to drag it across. I'm going to relate it to this zip code right here. And let up on it. And it's going to give it a name, which I'm not going to access. It's going to tell me the parent table is table donations and the child table is table zip codes. In this case, there should be a one-to-one relationship. When I put one zip code in, it should find only one zip code in the child table that has a city and state in it. In this case, I wanted to do the relationship only. I could have it come back in here and enforce this referential integrity. If I do that, then I might have problems down the road because I might want to come back in and use zip codes as the parent and find out how many donations were made out of a particular zip code, and by putting and changing these elements down here, that would preclude me from being able to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it the way it is and click OK. And now you'll notice again, as I had it before, my data sources have the two elements in it. I have table donations and I have table zip codes. If I was to drag table zip codes onto a form, let's go back here. If I was to drag table zip codes onto this form, what I would be doing is having an independent application or an independent database be applied. There'd be no relationship between the two of these. But let me show you something really cool here. If I open up table donations now, at the very bottom of it, notice what I've got. I've got a table zip codes, and whether I use this table zip codes or this table zip codes, they have the same thing in it. The difference is this table zip codes is directly related to this table donation. That's that relationship. So again, if I drag the bottom one over, I get an independent zip code. But watch this. If I take this zip code, and what I want to do is I'm going to just simply pull out details right here. I want details pulled out. I'll open it up and I'm going to grab my city and I'm going to drag it right over here, and I'm going to grab my state and I'm going to drag it over here. Let's line things up a little bit just for right now. We'll come back and make some changes, and I'm going to elongate that. Just come up with a little bit of territory. Now let's watch what happens. I'm going to come back over and I'm going to rerun the application. And you'll notice now that wherever I go, whatever record I move to, I'm going to get a city and a state pop up, which means now that I no longer need this city and this state in here. This city and state right here came from out of the original donations table. I don't need that any longer. I don't want the user to type that in, because when the user goes back in and they type in a particular zip, let's just show you what's going to happen here. First thing is I'm going to get rid of these guys. I want to redo it again, because they're text boxes right now. I don't want them text boxes, and it give me an opportunity to show you a trick here. So I'm going to go back to this zip code bottom one. I have to use this one. I can't use this guy here. If I did him, I would see the first record. I'd never see him change. There's no relationship. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to city. I'm going to hit this drop down, and I'm going to make it into a label. This tells it what it's going to look like when it drops it across, and I want this guy set up as a label as well. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and drag him across. So I'm going to drag across city, and now it's coming up as a label. And I'm going to drag across state, and it's coming across as a label as well. Now I'm going to get rid of both of these captions. I'm going to come back over to this table here. And the best solution to this would be to go back to my original select statement and remove the city and state out of that original select statement, because you're duplicating the data. There's a redundancy there. But for right now, just let me prove that this is working. So I'm going to grab these two fields. I'm going to take them out entirely. I'm now going to take label 2. I'm going to line it right there. I'm going to do this label. It's interesting it called them both label 2s. Let's take a look and see what the names of them are real quickly. Let's go back over to properties, city label 2, and should be state label 2. That's kind of strange that they left the label 2 on it, but those will disappear immediately. You won't see them, and let's go ahead and run it and prove it. Oh, we have an error in here. Let's take a look and see what's that error. Oh, I'll bet you because I deleted those two fields out, we had validation on them. So, how do we correct that? There's a couple of ways to do that. The first thing is, here's my error message at the bottom. By double clicking on this is going to take me into the code behind, and it's going to tell me that that event handler does not exist. So let's double click here, and there, actually it took me into my code itself and says this element state text box doesn't exist anymore because I deleted it. So I'm going to get rid of this entire event handler here. See if those errors go away down below. They do, but now when I build it, I'm going to get a new error because that event handler no longer exists. So let's build it. Oh, no error. I'm surprised on that. Let's go back in and let's rerun the application. The reason the error didn't pop up is because the text box no longer existed, so that entire region within the code behind was not added, so it was nothing to delete out. So as I thumb through it, you'll see down below that the city and the state are automatically applied for me. And anytime you come back in here, and here's a Seattle here. Let's take that one. So that's 98121, and if I change that, let's do 99207. Oops, I'm going to do escape here. Let's do a 99207 for that donation. And now I'm going to click back out of it and click back to it. And now notice it's Spokane, Washington. It's reassigned it. Pretty cool trick. Next thing I'd like to do, and probably the last thing within this demonstration, is to show you how to write a search feature. What I like to do is be able to search any name that exists within this text box right here. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an area for that search. So because I'm lazy here, I'm going to grab these two elements. I'm going to copy them. I'm going to paste. I'm going to drag it down over here. And I'm going to change the text on that guy to be search. And I'm going to call that text box, for my purposes, text search. Again, it comes down to a design style. What I could do is I could type some information in here, have a button, click that button, and whatever is in this text box, I could search for that. Or I can do a change on this text box. So anytime I type something into this text box, it's going to search for that and bring that up. I think that's the method that I'm going to choose to demonstrate right now because it's kind of cool. So right here, I'm going to take and create an event handler, and I want to do a text change. So every time I add a character in here, I want it to launch this event handler. So I double click here, and there I am. Now let's go back to that binding source right here, because this binding source is really going to do the magic for me. I'm going to copy this guy so I don't have to type it in. And if I back up here, you'll notice there's all kinds of cool stuff in here that you can play around with. There is a feature in here. There's a sort feature. Whatever field that you put in there that exists within your data will be sorted. But I'm going to do a filter here. Right there. Now the filter is the equivalent of the where clause. So I'm going to say filter is equal to, if I go back to my data, let's just take a look at that data set. I've got this field called name. So if I was going to write this out in a select clause and I want to grab everybody whose name starts with particular characters, I'm going to use that like statement, standard SQL statement. So let's come back over here and I'm going to say where name is like. Now you'll recall that the like statement has a wildcard in it, and that wildcard is a percent symbol. So I want everything that starts with what is in that text box and ends with I don't care what. So let's take a look at how I might add that in. So where the name is like, and then I have to have an apostrophe, because remember my data is going to look something like this, where it's like AF percent symbol. Okay. And that would bring up everybody whose name starts with an AF. I'm trying to create that format, duplicate that format up here. I'm going to add in right here an apostrophe. That's going to surround my data. Then I'm going to read what's in that text box, that text search text box, text property. Then what I need to do after that is I need to add back in a percent symbol. Let's try that. And then apostrophe at the end. I think that's going to make it work. That, folks, right there is pretty much all I need to do in order to create a search feature. Assuming it works. Let's test it out. Okay, have the application open. And, oh, notice the problem I have here is I made a mistake. When I copied name across over here, what I did is I copied the association along with it. I need to get rid of that association because right now it's searching and it's not finding that data. So let's close the application out. Let's work back over here again. Let's come back over to our properties, and at the very tip top here under data bindings, if I open that up, I will see that there's the association right there. I'm just going to delete all that data out. I should have probably copied in an empty text box to begin with. And that should take care of that issue. Sometimes taking a shortcut's not always the shortcut. Let's rerun it. And it opens up. Let's search for everybody whose name starts with the letter S. There we go. And how about SM? How about SMY? The Smythe. And you see I've got a search feature built in, and it was as simple as that code right there. And let's just stop it and take a look at what it's doing here. I'm going to put a stop right there because the program's still running, and I'm going to back up one character. So we're going to get all the people to start with SM. Now, what's in the text box? If I point to it, it's going to tell me it's SM. That filter right now has nothing in it. It has the previous SMY in it. So when I step through here, let's take a look at what the filter says it is now. It's where name is like ampersand, SM percent, ampersand. Super. One other thing I could do. If I wanted to beef up my search feature, I could add a percent symbol right at the beginning as well. What's that going to do for me? Well, it's going to make my search feature say that whatever I type in the text box has to be included within the name somewhere. So let's take a look at how that might work. So if I type in SM now, I'm going to get every name that has an SM somewhere in it. Not just the Smith as you see in the first one, but look at here. I have an SM in this SESMA name. There's another Smith. There's an SM right now in the first names. That's what the wildcard will do in the middle. By the way, notice that I've got two different fills created here. Okay. The first fill is the table zip codes that was added, the second fill. And then the first one, or excuse me, the bottom one is the one that we originally had. So originally we had this one. It came back in and added this second. If I was going to update two data sets, and right now I'm only using table zip codes to look up the city and state, but if I was going to be updating the data set, then I would come back down and I would add that update statement right here with the other one. I'd make sure that both tables were being updated. In this particular case, I'm not updating both, but that is a good point, and that is that if the child table has records that are inserted, this will work as well. It will maintain that relationship even in an insert statement. So let's go back in and review a little bit about what we've talked about so far. In the very beginning, we talked a little bit about what a data set was. I told you a data set is a local database. All that data that comes out of your table comes back into your data set, which represents a memory database. Inside that data set, we have table adapters. So here's a representation of our data set, and we have table adapters in it. Each one of these are table adapters as opposed to being tables as you would find up on the database. We talked a little bit about the grids and how I can drag a grid on, and if I don't already have a data set created, that grid will create the data set for me, or I can create the data set first and use that data set within my grid as we did in the very first example. We talked about once we add that grid in, how do we format that grid? We also talked a little bit about the details. So maybe you might want to have that grid, as we did within this example, just display the records, but below the grid you allow the user to do the editing, the updating, the inserting, what have you. Why? Because it's much easier to validate this data than it is to try to validate this. We also talked a bit about that binding source, and I told you that we're going to use a lot of that. We didn't use the table zip codes adapter, but notice it was added in, so I could search by that as well. But what we were using is the binding source over here, the binding source of the table donations. We talked about the navigator, that we could drag and add to your form, or not, and those navigators automatically have features added into them, like the top, the bottom, the next. But we also talked about how we could add our own buttons in that do exactly the same thing to give our own look and feel back to the application, as opposed to that VCR type control that they give us. We talked about how to update data once data has been added, deleted, how to update the underlying data source, which would be geeky for how do you update the table that the data was originally written to. Because remember, we've never written one insert, update, or delete statement. All of that has been written for us and embedded within that table adapter when it was created. And then towards the end, we talked about related data, how we could go back in and add a child table in, relate that child table together, and then add that data from our data sources over here back onto our form and maintain that relationship. But you have to always remember, the biggest mistake made is people assume that this is the related table zip codes, and that is not. The related table zip codes is this one. This falls underneath the parent, which is table donations. We closed out by talking about how to create and use the filter of the binding source. The filter allowed us to go back in and add a search feature. So hopefully at this point, the basics behind this make sense. You can actually dive quite a bit deeper in this, but I've covered a pretty good amount